Oh, look at everyone coming in. It is so lovely. Hi, Ben. Hi, Carmo. I wish that we could be together in person. Oh, hi, Faisal. You're here too. Getting a bit overexcited. All right. Okay, so I think there might still be a few more people joining, but let's get started. So what we wanted to do today, so I guess we should start from the beginning. So we were going to be in Seville. We were going to do a whole day of immigration stuff, and we probably would have talked about things like posted workers, and we probably would have talked about Brexit. And then we would have tried to do something that was relevant to other parts of the world that wouldn't have been so self-centered, you know, so we would have done some Latin American stuff, we would have done some Asia stuff. Obviously, we can't do any of that now. The only thing that we can possibly talk about when we talk about immigration is the impact, both now and next, of coronavirus, and what we as immigration and relocation and mobility professionals ought to be doing about it. And how we should be advising our clients and how we should be advising ourselves on how to make some type of sense of this new environment. So what we want to do, we have a rather ambitious number of people, but I didn't want to leave any part of the world out, because clearly the whole thing of a pandemic is that it's global, right? So what we thought we'd do is go around the world, starting with Asia Pacific, going through Europe, through Latin America, and then finally onto the US, to talk about the impact so far. So what's happening right now? Can people get into you know, your country or your region? And if so, is that entry permission restricted to certain categories, or how does that work? And then we want to talk about quarantine requirements. I also am going to ask our speakers to talk about exit requirements, because I think that's a very new immigration procedure, really. Well, it's an emigration procedure, which I think we ought to be paying attention to. And then finally, we want to spend a bit of time talking about what might happen next. So not trying to kind of look into a crystal ball and predict the future, but we wanted to talk about, on the theme of resilience and brilliance, we wanted to talk about how we as professionals in this arena can be as resilient as possible. So what should we, and how our clients can be resilient. So what should we be saying to our clients? How can we be hopeful and optimistic about how our clients can start to travel again and get their people to where they need to be? What should we be doing? So I am not going to talk too much, which I always say, and then I always do talk too much, but I'm definitely not going to talk too much. So we're going to start off with Asia, and I think we have the beautiful and wonderful Lily calling in from Singapore, who's going to tell us what's going on in Singapore. And I think, Lily, you're going to talk a tiny bit about China as well. So
Yes. Is it Pretty first or me first? Okay, anyway, I things are looking better because we do see improvement in the certain market. Countries in Asia Pacific region are similarly not spared from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The responses made by the government has affected corporate workforce planning, immigration processes, and processes and policies in a very, very massive way. So today's context, I will speak only about China and Singapore. If anyone would like to know about the situation in countries in Asia Pacific region, please feel free to contact my Relocate Asia Pacific partners. We do have representatives in various locations. So China and Singapore have fared reasonably well in regards to the control of COVID-19. So both countries are determined to prevent the virus from peaking again. Strict laws have been introduced, and as we all know, Asian governments are strict. Strict laws can be reintroduced anytime so as to achieve the goal to contain COVID-19. One positive point to note is that China and Singapore are willing to open up their borders progressively. We do see that both China and Singapore are independently working with various countries on bilateral cross-border arrangements so as to to help business travel less cumbersome. As we speak now, China's domestic market actually is back to almost normal or at pre-COVID level. So China seems to be ready to open up their international market. In late March, China closed its border completely to non-Chinese citizens, including those with valid resident visa. So many expats are not able to return to China then. Last week, China has introduced a more relaxed entry provision. Starting from Monday, that is like 2 days ago, September 28, expats who holds a valid resident permit may now enter China. We do not They do not require any more further additional document except a negative COVID test result dated no more than 3 days before their flight schedule. So you know, previously an invitation letter and an entry visa, they were all required. For new application, for a new brand new application for an entry visa are subject to very long and tedious requirements still. So according to my Reload Aid China partner Shelley, she advised that companies in China should try to extend their employees' contracts where possible rather than to let the contracts come to a natural end and start the process to bring in new employees, because this process may take months to complete. For Singapore, things are getting better too. Because of the tiny market, it is important that Singapore keep its economy running as soon as possible. We don't have as huge a domestic market as like in China. So currently, Singapore is in the phase of easing their restriction. As we speak now, Singapore has unilaterally opened its border to 2 additional countries so as to help to revive the tourism and travel market. So Singapore will allow short-term travels for travels from New Zealand, Brunei, Australia, and Vietnam. Um, what else?
There is some
In
hope.
terms,
Yeah,
yeah,
there is some hope. So China, you've got people with residence permits can come back. But what if you're a
yeah.
new, what if you want to move to China now and you get a work permit and
Oh, the process is long. According to what Shelley has shared with me, is
yeah,
that you need an entry permit, you need to have an invitation letter, and
yeah,
this will take months to process. It's
yeah,
still very strict. They are very careful because any of the Asian governments are strict,
yeah,
as we all know. They will try their best to curb the COVID-19 situation.
yeah,
It
yeah,
is just way too long. It may take 4 months to get a get
yeah.
a new visa to come. Yeah,
So possible but slow, right? And then Singapore, so Singapore business travel is opening up again with these special lanes, with these special agreements. So I guess that's complicated for people to keep kind of on top of, right? To know which countries they can travel to and from. But Singapore employment pass holders are fine, hey? They can still come.
yeah. Singapore, I think what we are engaging is that any of the work pass, so long you have a work pass or a dependent pass or a valid pass, you can enter into Singapore.
Yeah,
However, travelers really need to take note that you need to have an entry permit. This entry permit is required before you
okay.
start your traveling process. It is actually a control strategy to gauge the level of risk of an arriving traveler being infected from that particular country.
Yeah,
So my take is that chances of that if you come from the hardest hit country, then your entry permit into Singapore may become slimmer.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So it depends where you're coming from, not your nationality so much as where you're coming from. So
Yeah, where
basically
you
the
are
message
coming
is
from.
that it's possible, but it's difficult. But it's possible because I think sometimes I'm talking to clients who are thinking that you really can't go anywhere. You know, like it's like just don't even bother, and it is. You know, I suppose our message should be yes, you can, but I mean it might be difficult, and they should call you.
Yeah, but Singapore has its own other problem too, because the job protectionism is quite a hot topic right now. This will affect the talent mobility flow,
Yeah,
because the Singapore government is very into striving to help the business to stay afloat by providing, not only providing massive help, grants and relief to companies, but they also want to save jobs of the local. So in
yeah.
order to save job for the local, we have seen that they have the government, the authorities have introduced very stringent criteria for work pass application.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
may
So it's
become
difficult
very hard
anyway,
for an
even before this was
mm,
happening, and now the economic impact of all of this will make it hard. So I actually have a question for you from the chat thing, which is for in principle approval holders from the US. Are you seeing entry approvals being granted for people coming from the US? Obviously, given the
yes,
time, right? So that's good.
it
And then I
is
have
good.
another question for you, which is the PU letter, so this is about China, is the PU letter still required for new applicants? I think we actually addressed that one already, right? So the
Yes,
answer is yeah, it
it
is.
is required.
Yeah, cool. Well, I could talk to you literally all day about this, but I think you should now be allowed to drink your evening drink, and we should ask Preeti about India.
Thank you,
Thank you, because
Sophie.
there might be more.
Cheers.
All right, Preeti, tell us what's happening in India. Can we come? Are we allowed?
Of course. So the first and the most important development that's happened in the past few days is the establishment of air travel bubble, which means that India has established reciprocal air travel arrangements with 13 countries, which has a mix of countries in the West to East and some Middle Eastern countries like US, UK, Canada, and then Germany, France, Bahrain, Nigeria, or Qatar, and Maldives, Japan. So people from these countries can actually come to India as long as they have a valid visa. So if I go back in time and actually start from the beginning, India suspended international travel end of March, around 18th or the 22nd of March. All international travel was stopped. And then phase-wise, they opened up international travel. So what India really did was for the first few months, for the first 3 months, there was no travel for business or for work. It was primarily evacuation flights. So evacuation flights to all the countries where these expatriates in India were leaving the country, and those flights were bringing Indians back. So, so far about more than 3,000 flights have been operated under the lockdown phase where people were taken from India and brought back to India. In June, phase-wise operations of employment visa holders started, where only the visa holders, obviously it has to be a valid visa because no missions were open then, and no new visas were being issued. So if you had a valid employment visa, you could still come back to India. And then the dependents were added, the OCI card holders, which is a lifetime visa, was added, then business visa holders who have consular visas as opposed to electronic visas, that was added. So in the phase-wise manner, people have been now allowed to come in. Most recently, my example would be Italy, where we were able to work with the embassy there and impress upon them the importance of some Italian nationals to come to India, because the project really needed these people to come. But there is no air travel between India and Italy. So the Italian nationals got their visas in Italy, traveled to France, and then used the travel bubble arrangement between India and France to come to India, and they're now successfully here. So that is something that's happened.
Yeah. So then, yeah, I mean, are people using travel bubble arrangements to come, you know, going to try and spend time somewhere else and then come?
No, I wouldn't say that the travel bubble is being used to spend time somewhere else. It is still essential travel. So it's either employment or business or medical reasons or family reasons. Tourism has obviously not yet started. Even within India, it is very slowly opening up. We still have containment areas. We still have states grappling with the situation. We still have expatriates leaving the country, but we do have the green shoots, if I can call it, where people are now returning. People who had left in the month of March or April or May are now starting to return
and they have
to come back to their jobs.
They have to quarantine when they arrive, right? Or
yes. Yes. So different states have different quarantine requirements. Most essentially, it is 14 days. It's either split between 7 and 7, which is if you arrive in Delhi, you have to undergo a institutional quarantine for 7 days, and then 7 days of home isolation for international travelers. But in Maharashtra, in Mumbai, if you land, you have 4 days of institutional quarantine and then 10 days of homestay. So depending on where you enter, it is important to know that right now, although there are 34 international airports in India, only 4 are operational. So anybody who's coming to India has to go through they have to jump through several hoops to get here, registering with the mission in the US. There are no commercial flights that are coming to India except for Lufthansa and United. So any traveler coming to India, a non-Indian, must register with the Indian mission in their home country. There are obviously very long layovers in the transit. So they have to also register with the Indian mission in the layover country. So So for example, if someone from the US, if Jim Alexander wants to come from US to India, he comes through France, he will have to register with the Indian Embassy in US as well as in France.
Wow.
Yes, all of this is managed beautifully. It's quite effective, efficient. People are using it. We are having people return to India now, and they're quite satisfied with the way the arrangements are being made.
And how about people leaving? So we were going to talk about exit requirements, and actually somebody's just asked a question about this. Indian people who want to go out, well, if there are hardly any flights, I guess it's a bit difficult for them to leave anyway. But if you wanted to come and see me, Preeti, would you be able to? If we have a little meeting together in London.
If it was a pleasure flight, I am afraid not.
And it would be a pleasure.
Of course, and trust me, the pleasure was all mine. But so far, the exit requirements primarily depend on the destination country. So if UK is accepting travelers, and I have a valid visa to the UK, so maybe I'm working in UK and I got stuck in India. As long as I have a valid visa to go to the UK and I'm able to prove that at the time of boarding, yes. So India launched a unique program called the Vande Bharat Mission, which meant that the Indian Airlines, the national airlines of India, is making these flights to and from the country. So it's taking people from India to the UK and then bringing Indians back on that flight to India. So, so it is possible, but of course it needs to have a really valid reason. At this point, obviously pleasure flights or leisure flights are not encouraged. But if it's a valid reason, yes, if I have a work permit, why not?
So the Indian government has nothing, they're not kind of trying to stop you. And then how about people, well, actually I have a question of my own before I get onto the next one, which is, you said that when travel was sort of starting up again, first of all, it was people with consular visas rather than electronic visas. So would you recommend in future that people should get consular visas, like would it be better if you wanted, you know, in future when things are kind of coming back to normal, and if I come on a business trip, should I be getting a consular visa kind of just in case? Or
Sophie, what I would like to say here is that instead of what I feel, it is more important to understand what is permitted. At this point, electronic visas are not acceptable. They're suspended.
yeah,
So even if Sophie King would like to go online and apply for an electronic visa, unfortunately, you can't.
I can't
Because
anyway.
it doesn't exist right now. It's suspended. So at this point, if you really have to come to India for business or for employment, you will have to approach the embassy. And incidentally, online applications are not being accepted. So you have to actually go and physically drop off an application, which also means actually physically filling out a form and of course submitting all the letters and all of that. So electronic visas so far are suspended. We are waiting for the time when electronic visas are accepted again. I think the reason why it's not done is because of, as I mentioned, the various hoops. One of the major hoop is that you have to submit a negative COVID test 96 hours before you actually are scheduled to fly.
Yeah.
And then in an electronic visa, they may not be able to, they may not have the screening, because electronic visa is just, you just fill in the form and you get the visa. So this requirement of a negative COVID certificate, as long as this exists, I think that electronic visas would still remain suspended.
Yeah, so I think maybe consular visas, even in future, even once electronic visas come back, if it were me.
It is advisable in the beginning, yes.
Yeah, I might be. And then there's, so we're running out of time, but we did build in a bit of extra time. So, and this is such a good question. What about people whose employment visas expired if they had left and if their family had stayed? Because obviously the employment visa and the dependent visa can have different validities, right? So what happens about those people? Could they get new ones, or were the families?
You know, it's funny that you asked me this question, because we actually dealt with a case like that, where the employment visa holder traveled out of the country. He went to Morocco on a business visit, and during lockdown, his visa expired, and his family obviously was here. So we were able to approach the Ministry of Home Affairs, explain the situation to them. And even for them to get on an evacuation flight was very tough, because they were in a city where there is no international airport. So they would have had to travel to another city, which was again not permitted. So their dependent visa was extended for 2 months.
But he could not come back.
He couldn't come because there were no flights and no Indian mission was open at that time.
How long?
Yeah, so we did deal with that, but now what's happening is that as things with India are quite popular, different missions or different posts outside of India have different rules. So somebody coming from France may have to revalidate their employment visa even if it's valid, but somebody coming from Israel did not have to do that.
Okay, so check.
Or someone coming from the US did not have to do that, but someone coming from Malaysia had to do it. So again, it's almost case by case basis, but it's opening up and it's getting streamlined slowly. Actually, today is the 30th of September and we are expecting, or we're hoping that there is some news. At this point, as it stands, international travel is suspended till the 25th of October, but we are hoping. The phase-wise open up is happening, and from next week onwards, I think Delhi, the restaurants and the bars have opened up, but in Maharashtra, we will see that happening next week onwards, and some other states still haven't announced it. So things are still uncertain. Country is really huge. Every state is dealing with it differently, and that's why I think it's tough to have a one-size-fits-all kind of an approach to India.
Okay, so basically top tips for people who've got clients who want to come to India is probably not going to happen anytime soon, but to check, because case by case it may be different depending on from where they're going to, and they should not lose hope and they should call you and you can.
Of course. So what we are saying to our clients is that new visas have now been started to be issued, especially employment visas, because obviously the economy needs to start up and projects are being suspended and they need to get the work going. So employment visas are now being issued. a lot of countries, the missions have started to open up. We've done visas from Australia, from Malaysia, from Singapore. We did one from Italy, from France, from US,
Yeah.
from Canada. So it's opening up slowly.
It's opening up at possible. Yeah.
In fact, we launched a unique program. What we did innovative during the lockdown was something that we launched a program called Lexigent Cares. And under the Lexigent Cares, the information support was so extensive because really there was no work happening on the field. There was no work happening on the ground. There was no movement happening. So under the Lexigent Care program, we were informing all our HRs, expatriates, international travelers about what's really happening here.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's available, what's not available, what are the quarantine rules, which airport is open, what are the quarantine rules in different states, which are the various hoops that they have to jump through. So the information support was so extensive and it was so well received that people felt that this was the kind of support that they and we were able to bring all the information, relevant information together.
That's the thing. It's all about the information. I really think
Absolutely.
it is. But look, we're going way out of time, so we must stop because I don't know what will happen. So let's move. Thank you so much, Preeti. It's so helpful, and I think there will be more questions about India. So stick around.
Absolutely.
So Anand, tell us about Switzerland. Are you going to say that all the cantons are different? That's what everyone always says when I ask them about Switzerland.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, all the cantons are different, of course, in Switzerland. But during the pandemic, during the lockdown phase, between March and June, especially when the most restrictions on immigration were imposed, the federal council took the lead and said, okay, now for once, we're going to regulate this for the whole nation in the same way. So during that time, the cantons did not have much possibilities to divert from the regulations that were imposed at the federal level. Switzerland was one of the countries that were affected quite heavily and quite soon when COVID started to spread in Europe. One of the main reasons is that it's a neighboring country of Italy, of course, and Italy was one of the hotspots. However, the Swiss government did take quite some time to really impose immigration restrictions, and one of the reasons were that they really rely on the cross-border workforce. So there are a lot of people commuting from France and Italy. So closing the border would mean that these people would face quite a lot of difficulties to enter Switzerland as well. And the economy, especially in the border region, could not really have them or accept to not have them there because they are working in sensitive sectors, like in the hospitals, in the health sector. So Switzerland, on one hand, they were really dependent on this workforce.
I think we need the pharmaceutical companies to be working. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's why. But by mid of March, they had then to close borders. But they said, okay, cross-border commuters, they are allowed all the time to enter Switzerland. Yeah. In June, they started then to ease the measures. And so what's the situation now? Currently, Switzerland differentiates between people coming from high-risk country and from a country that is not considered as a high-risk country. So which are these countries? Most of the countries outside of the Schengen area, with very few exceptions, like Australia, Canada, Thailand, for example, they are not considered to be high-risk countries. So anyone from one of these countries, from the Schengen countries or one of these countries, can enter Switzerland without any restrictions anymore. So even for tourism purpose, they could enter Switzerland. For all other countries, which are still considered as high-risk countries, there are still a lot of restrictions in place. It does not really affect employment visa holders, because Switzerland has started again to issue employment visas. It does not impact people with a residence permit in Switzerland, so they are allowed to enter. However, tourists or people even for business trips, they still face a lot of restrictions if they want to enter Switzerland and if they're coming from one of these countries.
Okay. And then quarantine, when they get there, do they have to quarantine?
They have to quarantine, yeah, exactly. But there, and that raises a lot or causes a lot of confusions. The list of countries from which people need to go to quarantine is not the same list as the high risk, non-high risk countries as for the immigration restrictions. So it could well be possible that people coming from a non-risk country and are allowed to enter still need to go to quarantine once they have arrived in Switzerland. And it's also that a negative test result does not exempt from going to quarantine. It's not an institutional quarantine, so you could just go to your own residence or to any hotel and then stay there for 10 days. But you would have to inform the cantonal health department and that you're here and on quarantine.
Yeah. So basically, people can, employment-based entry is okay.
That's
even if
okay.
you're coming from a country with pretty high current, incidence of the.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
That's okay. Business travel, not so much. Quarantine. So actually Switzerland's pretty much open, really, for business.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. For employment, they're quite open again. Yeah.
Yeah, and especially within the EU, it's aligning with the EU, which, so we have to move on very fast. So I'm sorry, Anna, because I've,
Yeah.
But Kasia, I would like you to please tell us all about the whole of the EU and some parts of Eastern Europe and Central Europe, basically just many, many, many countries in the next 5 to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Sophie.
You can do it.
I'll try my best. It was like quite a puzzle for me to pull the countries which would be good examples to discuss in this meeting today. Just like, in general terms, I think for Europeans, it's quite obvious that all of the countries supposed to follow the European Council guidelines in terms of which countries should be green listed and which countries should be allowed for entry into Europe, because we as one big nation, let's put it that way, should have the same rules given we all belong to Schengen. So there is no borders, there's no restrictions. So we should be, to cross from country to the country easily. But we do see that this isn't working in practice very well, because each country is putting up their own lists, their own clearance processes and procedures on how this can operate, and we can see this changing, whether it's Spain or Czech Republic. I was just trying to look up what does Spain do, and they have their own list, and they have a list which they've cleared as the one that they want to permit the non-Schengen countries to enter Spain. They put their own process on how they allow those individuals, whether they the quarantine measures are applied, which got relaxed. So now there's only online form that can be populated in order to confirm whether I can or cannot come to the country, which is good. There were tests at the time, so the process with the test is changing as well. So some of the countries are giving up the quarantine measure to the benefit of the test. For example, in Hungary, where you can be released from the quarantine requirement if you produce the test and you present this to the relevant institutions. I was looking at the Czech Republic, which I found really interesting, with a very convoluted who gets tested, why gets tested, from which country, which green list are we talking about? European green list, Czech Republic green list. So I was just, okay, it's a maze for foreign nationals as well as their clients. I think they find it extremely difficult to navigate through what is permissible, what's not permissible. Can my employees come to the country, or they cannot come to the country? Will my application process or will not process? My employee is highly qualified. I think European Council made the recommendation to treat highly skilled workers as essential workers. But does every country follow that?
And yeah, what counts as highly qualified, right? Because Massimo was saying on LinkedIn, it was so interesting. He was like, why is the blue card counts as highly qualified, but the ICT permit or the single permit doesn't, or the other, I can't actually remember, but it's like, come on, really, both of these are highly qualified routes. Although Belgium has now recognized them both, apparently, so.
Yeah, I guess they want to set an example and then they show to all the other
And I was thinking as well, how is anyone going to know? Like if you turn up from some other country, you know, how are people going to know if you were actually a resident of that country or not? If you say, I'm a resident, I am an American national, but I'm a resident of Canada, and here's my Canadian, you know, how is the person at the airport in Warsaw going to know whether you're Canadian residence permit? You know, I don't know about how.
It's a very good question. Okay, I guess you know, like Polish authorities do rely on, let's flip the pages of the passport and check if someone had a stamp, like if someone has the record they have traveled. They also can produce supporting documentation, and quite often, whether it's Poland or any other jurisdiction, it is highly recommendable to have appropriate documents supporting your travel, that it's this company connected with a company from sending country sending you over to this other jurisdiction. The host country also vouches, declares that, like, yes, this traveler is coming to my country. I was looking at Estonia just like recently as well. Like the company has an obligation there to guarantee the travel from the airport to the accommodation.
China has a similar thing, right? Yeah.
So I think that the governments are getting quite creative in terms of how they can monitor and force also foreign nationals and those who are hosting them to take a little bit more of control over this population coming into the country and find the ways to contain the spread of the coronavirus through those measures. Whether those will work or not, it's also questionable, but those are at least the attempts that everybody is trying to take. But like I have to say, like from the countries I've looked at, like Poland seems like a very open, like to anybody who works, who has the permission to work. Yes, we welcome you. Come over, as long as there is a flight, because like you know, flights are also quite restricted, and they are just available between certain countries. So in that sense, that made travel like more restrictive. Also, like interestingly for Poland, even those who don't have the work permit, but you can provide supporting documentation that you come under work permit exemption to do some essential work, like a maintenance or installation, which is associated with some sort of agreements, can be permissible. Like the government finds it difficult to deal with it because the documentation supporting it is challenging, and it's challenging for those individuals as well to prove before the airplane that this is why they are going when they are visa exempt, for example. I had a Malaysian national who couldn't get on the plane because he was told by the airline, no,
this is the thing, right? It's not just whether you can get into the country, but whether you can get on the plane. And the two things are not necessarily the same thing. You might be able to get on the plane, but not get into the country, or vice versa, you know?
Yeah, exactly. So this whole, like, you know, plan that needs to be put in place to ensure like a secure travel for this individual when crossing multiple borders. And as you know, like from Asia, when you travel, you rarely travel on the direct flight, let's say to Poland. You would go to Germany, you would go through the Netherlands, which, like, you know, airport is more suitable. And the question is, what will happen there? Will they
every step
onward journey? So like every step has to be checked and well planned for the client. So they are not like returned home like from the
So people can come. So basically, people can come to most European places. People can come, especially if they're working. But often for business, not. Quarantine more likely than not, I would say quarantine, but now quarantine is being substantially replaced with tests. Most of the countries do facilitate the possibility of this, whether this is like, government sponsored or you have to pay for this test, can be relieved from the quarantine if you produce the test in the country that, and I think countries are going towards the direction we want to have from our own country, not from prior to travel. Although you will have these rapid tests as well, right? So like Dubai, you have to have a test, and then they make you do another one, and then you have to quarantine till you get the results, which could be 2 days, but actually is usually quicker. And once they have, they have these rapid tests now that you can just. It's half an hour, right? So
depends which country. Not all countries have it rapid. I
know. I was talking to someone from New York last night, and she was like, "Oh yeah, we just do them all the time." I was like, "Right, yeah." Over here, we're out of school, and our children are at home for a long time while we're waiting.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
Wow,
So
super interesting. Yeah. So, Irina, you were going to fill in some stuff about Russia, I think, and you know that part of the world. But actually, maybe I should quickly mention we haven't got a special section on UK, and all I'm going to say about the UK is it's basically the same as most of these other places. I think it's pretty similar to Switzerland, and actually, so in the UK, people who are working are allowed in, and actually business travellers are allowed too, but they do have to quarantine most of the time unless they're from a travel corridor country, which is a short list which keeps getting shorter.
Yeah.
So yeah, Irina, tell us about Russia. And I think, were you going to say anything about other parts of CIS?
Yeah. It's interesting as I was listening to Kasia, how different approaches, well, even within the EU, how countries took very different approaches. Same in CIS, and well, Russia and CIS. It's unbelievable how polar, you know, how different the approaches of each of the country is. You know, coming from super strict and super conservative to very relaxed, with hardly figures to back that up.
I heard that Belarus is very relaxed and that we can all go to Belarus whenever we want to.
Exactly. Well, it's mostly the other way around, but I'll get there. So yes, I was thinking I'll start with Russia, because at the moment, currently, this is actually one of, well, besides Azerbaijan, which is actually in complete lockdown until today, and we're waiting for update on legislation, Russia is actually one of the strictest jurisdictions in terms of travel. So ever since end of March, Russia introduced a ban for all international commercial flights, entry for all the foreigners, and until, well, pretty much today, with the exception of 11 countries, it remains the same. So now the general rule is, yes, there's a ban, but there are a number of countries, including the UK, Switzerland, Turkey, Republic of Korea, UAE, and a number of CIS countries. These are the only countries where the citizens of which are allowed, but they're allowed only by air, and only coming from this country's direct, and the nationals of this country. So if you're a national of any other countries coming from, say,
a resident. So if you're American but living in Kazakhstan, you can't come.
Yeah, doesn't work. Yeah, but if you decided to come and visit and see the beautiful fall we're having here in Moscow, you would be totally free to do that. You wouldn't need to quarantine. You would need to have a negative PCR test. That's the new thing. And off you go. But the major actual impact for Russia, if you decided that you wanted to come and work in Russia, then there is an extra step now has been introduced as a general rule, extra step of additional authorization from a number of state authorities and ministries for each individual assignee that is planning to come in. So on the one hand, it actually finally allowed the process to, well, to kick off the new work permits, and at least to do something and get people in. But it's a bit of a delayed process. And then actually, as you come into Russia on your work visa, you must quarantine, even if you're coming with a PCR test. So you have to
quarantine in wherever I want, or quarantine in a
wherever you want. Wherever you want. So that's for employment, and the tricky thing for employment, and that's really, I think, the bad wording of the legislation, which I hope going to be fixed, is for now the employment permit and work visa would be granted only to the actual to the main applicant, not to the family members. So for now, the family members are, it's really on a case-by-case basis, whether, because the wording of the law is so vague that each and every person interprets.
You're trying anyway, so you're trying to submit it anyway, and some of them are
Yeah, and some of them successful and some of them are not, and that's the worst case, the worst thing, because you cannot tell your client that actually we can do it, but then your client will always come back and say, hey, they did it, or well, there is no guarantee. But we really are expecting some changes to that legislation. But literally last week, in Russia, they've suspended the validity of all the immigration paperwork until mid-December, which is kind of a, on the one hand it's good, but on the other hand it's like a bad sign that, you know, they are expecting to essentially keep all the restrictions. Well,
this is the thing, right? This is the thing. I mean, this is the long term. So Kasia was saying, you were saying, weren't you, Kasia, that you think, and there is actually the first question we had in our kind of Q&A is, do we think that tests, it's going to be post-vaccine or post kind of COVID test that things start? And it does seem like those are the options, right? You know, because countries have to open up again. They have to. So it's going to have to be, I think.
I'm really happy that at least the PCR test, you know, is already changing things. And is already, well, as Kasia mentioned, it does take away quarantine in most, well, when you with CIS in most of the locations. So hopefully that's step one. And I think, well, at least in our part of the world, with all the restrictions in place for quite a while, there is already a way, a more or less known way how to work, not around them, but how to work with them. And I think that's, well, speaking of resilience and brilliance, that's the message we should spread with our clients, you know, that yes, it's complicated, yes, it's maybe a bit longer, but it's possible, you know, if you look at any single, well, within our region.
This is the thing. I feel like that. I feel like it's complicated, it's difficult, and it's awful. And these last 6 months have been awful for us because we're doing all of this stuff mainly for free. But I actually think, and I'm not sure how I feel about this, but I also think that when things get complicated and difficult and nasty, you know, it does give us a chance to shine and to help our clients, you know, and maybe some clients who've been doing, or companies who've been doing a lot of things in-house actually realize that it is worth speaking to a professional who does this all day, every day, you know, so it could be an opportunity.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. And we are totally seeing it. And for us, you know, we've been working super closely with Chamber of Commerce, with various sort of business community as experts, working with government officials to actually navigate and to make exceptions, or to make exception become more or less the rule, and that finally felt very rewarding, you know, that that's why we're there, you know.
That's why we're there, exactly. And you can be part of it. And, you know, this is what I keep saying to clients is, you know, you should tell us and we should be part of creating possibly new legislation, which maybe will serve us better in the future, even once this is over, to have a bit more flexibility and that kind of thing, you know. Anyway, we should move on, I think. So Andreas, we've got you down for basically the whole of Africa, which you and Charles and everybody are always sort of reprimanding me about because it's so ridiculous to try and, but tell us about South Africa, and then if you can fit in any other African countries, then tell us about them too.
Okay, thanks. Hi everybody, hope you can hear me well. Yeah, I think I will try and give you a brief history actually of some, you know, African countries and not specific countries. So look at the bigger picture and there are some common tendencies, and then I come to the current situation. I'm going to focus on South Africa and a couple of other countries. So yeah, like with all the other countries really in the world, we started March, April with the lockdowns, and they were quite severe and they were quite, you know, the borders were really closed. And I think there were one or two exceptions, obviously Tanzania, for instance, where officially there was no COVID cases, according to the president. And then Zambia was also an exception where the international airport never closed. But I mean, in general, Africa was closed, right? So I think that was the first theme. The second one was then that I think by April, or by August probably, the first borders started to open, but only for special schemes. So people with work visas, citizens obviously were always allowed to be back, and more and more countries opened up, at least from a work visa point of view. South Africa, for instance, also was not very well published, but there was a special angle path through the Department of Trade and Industry. They sent a recommendation, and then the missions opened, although they were closed, but you could actually physically walk to the mission and they knock on the door and they let you in and they got your visa. They're literally like this. So very high maintenance, reserved for only C-level executives of multinational companies. And a couple of other countries did something similar. So there were special schemes mostly done through the Department of Trade and Industry. And then by, I would say by August, in particular, West Africa started opening their borders. And I mean borders, I mean international airports first. So West Africa were really the first ones. Kenya then also was quite early with early September. And then in Morocco also, they also opened up, obviously from a practical point of view again, not for tourists, but at least for work visa holders, etc. And then in Southern Africa, obviously everybody was waiting for South Africa because it just had by far the most cases. And I mean, obviously without South Africa, nothing is really happening much in Southern Africa at least. And here the good news, obviously I come to that a little bit later, but basically we're going to be open from the 1st of October onwards, and I zoom in onto this a little bit later. Yeah, so I think that was really the brief history of where we are now. I think where we now is as I said, in most African countries, you can actually process the local visa extensions by now, because obviously all the Home Affairs ministries were closed for a long, long time, and they were partly operating, like in Kenya, for instance, they never closed. But in South Africa, we were closed for 3 to 4 months, except for some citizen matters, but birth registration, etc. But subsequently now they're all coming back online, unfortunately maybe at 50% capacity only, so the processing times will be slower, but in general things are returning to normal in country.
And is there a giant backlog? Is there a huge backlog of stuff?
Well, in Kenya's case, obviously they continued working. In West Africa, they also continued working after the severe lockdowns, let's say until July. In South Africa, they actually, they used the time to clear the whole backlog. So what Home Affairs did is they went back to work, but they were closed for the public. So they extended the validity of all visas in country. And they've actually done this until the end of January, okay, to give them time. But they cleared the whole backlog. So in South Africa, there is no backlog anymore in temporary residence. And what will happen now is, as I said, the local applications are opening up now, and they're accepting applications now, and they gave themselves 3 months to process these to fall in line with the end of January deadline. Okay, so South Africa is kind of back to normal now, and the same applies pretty much for a lot of African countries. So obviously, like our neighboring countries, they're all waiting for our border to open, and that will happen now. So things will come back slightly to normality on that perspective. Yeah, I talked about, and then I think so I think that the second very important message is there, that we need to distinguish between tourism and obviously the workers. I mean, all the speakers before have said this already. It's a common theme, right? So people with work visas can actually come. We were able to get them in the past, and they could come. Kenya as well, even Mozambique, although there's a bit more restrictions there, but obviously that's a very important from an oil and gas perspective in Mozambique. But even there, so people with temporary residence visas for work or critical skills, in general, in Africa, they actually can fly in now and they can start working. And also, I think it's important to mention that, as I said, in South Africa in particular, the missions have started to work now. So you can actually apply for new visas now also properly, okay? The other common theme is, I think, that we will have absolutely no restrictions for African national passport holders. So they're trying to establish a kind of a travel bubble. At least some people are saying that. You could call it differently. But basically, because of the low cases in Africa in general, except now for South Africa, really, there will be no travel restrictions whatsoever for African passport holders, for instance, for South Africa.
But what if you're Nigerian but you live in, you know, Texas? Then because you have your African passport, you're okay. Or...
Well, that we still have to find out, because obviously in case of South Africa, the regulations are still not published, but the minister spoke actually an hour ago. So I will update you on that. But we don't know what happens now with people of passport versus residents, right? I mean, it makes no sense if you're Nigerian passport holder, but you live in the United States and United States is on the list, then it doesn't really make sense that you can come in.
You know, just hold your passport up to the virus.
Yeah. But I think the good news is that at least within Africa, there seems to be the restrictions are being lowered dramatically, especially for South Africa. Not one African country is on the list of prohibited countries. And I think what will happen is subsequently, even Mozambique and other countries will lower their entry barriers, because if South Africa has a low entry barrier, we all know that, you know, the other countries will lower theirs as well. Plus our numbers are down and we were the main culprit. So therefore, I think they will open. Interesting to know, maybe, for instance, that for tourism, Namibia is the only country which was always open for a month now for tourism, because of the paramount importance of the sector. Yeah, I think that's so where are we now? Coming to quarantine, really, the general theme in Africa is that there's no quarantine requirements anymore. So the majority of countries are following now the precedent of West Africa, but also of Kenya, where Kenya started quite early with a list of allowed countries, actually. So when you're on the list, you can come in without quarantine. South Africa has now, as I said, published an hour ago, 57 countries, a list where when you're on there, you can't come for tourism purposes. And I think that's, again, important to repeat. That's only applicable for tourism. If you, from the United States, or the Nigerian in the United States, and you actually have a work visa, or you want to apply for a work visa, you can still do that. So for work people, for our business, there are no restrictions. But for tourism, which is obviously so important for the economies here, there will be restrictions. But in case of South Africa, as I said, they put 57 countries onto the list, and the usual culprits are on there, obviously US, the UK, France, India, not Brazil, funny enough. So the BRICS seem to have pulled some strings there. Germany is not on there, Austria is not on there. So they really look at a risk approach, and they look at the numbers. And they will change it every 2 weeks, apparently. So that's really the situation. So for South Africa, basically from tomorrow onwards, we're open to the world for workers anyway, but also for tourists. So please, you know, so book a flight, come to South Africa, or at least to Southern Africa, because I can guarantee you they need any travel is welcome. There's no quarantine requirements. The usual test, obviously, with the 72 hours. We all know that. That's an international benchmark now. But that's pretty much it. So compared to my previous speakers, I would say fairly low thresholds at the moment.
So do you know what? I think you made a really good point a minute ago, which is that I noticed as well with the UK, when the UK published its list of travel corridors, you know, countries from which people could come without quarantining, and the US was not on the list, there was this giant song and dance, like, UK is banning Americans. And we weren't, like, nobody was banning Americans at all. You know, so it's really important to distinguish between what happens with work permit holders, what happens with tourists, and if people need to quarantine. And these are three completely different things, you know? So just because you have to quarantine doesn't mean you're not allowed to come in the first place. And I think some of our clients maybe don't, I think that more and more people are beginning to understand that. But, you know, this is the thing, like sometimes people, they can come and they are actually more able to travel and get into the country than they assume from reading the paper, especially the papers, you know, obviously overflow things a bit, right? Anyway, so we should move on. So Max, tell us about Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay and places
okay, thank you so much, Sophie. Let's start by taking a look at some coincidences among Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. As a result of the last quarantine extension released by the Chilean and Argentina authorities until October the 12th, both countries still continue with restrictions to receive foreign citizens without a transitory, temporary, or permanent visa. Okay. It means that the nationals from countries considered as a waiver in regular times before the COVID, for instance, Mercosur or European nationals, are still banned from entering to both countries because of the lockdown. Yeah. Of course, that the local and legal residents are allowed to cross borders with no restrictions. They can enter and leave the country whenever they want to, as long as they comply with some requirements. First of all, it's most important, 14 days quarantine will be mandatory if you return to the country. In some cases, this quarantine extension can be reduced from 14 days to 7 days if you submit a swab test or PCR. Yeah. And it will depend on the decision of each regional health authority in Chile. And in Argentina, the decision is even more decentralized for the intervention of the 23rd provinces in Argentina. And second, in case you travel abroad, regarding the exit requirements, some sanitary affidavits will be required in ground borders and sea borders. However, in some very particular cases, this is a very important point, authorities are allowing companies to apply for special entry permits, okay? Whenever applicants demonstrate the essential criteria of the activities that they are going to perform on the destination. It might include infrastructure activities, food productions, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, among other.
But work, right? Not business trips. Work.
No business trip. No.
Yeah.
You need to demonstrate that you're going to perform specific activities. It means about this. Yeah.
Yeah. I can't come and have a drink with you, basically.
Yeah. In terms of governmental organizations, they are working under special conditions, so they have increased the number of online procedures, reducing the personal attendance to the organism. In consulates, they have resumed activities, but they give him some priority to emergency cases. It is important to mention that these offices are not in charge of approving that special entry permit that I mentioned before. This is because the issue and the approval stage is taking care of the Central Immigration Office and the Foreign Affairs Office as well. All these immigration tips are definitely linked to the main question that I receive over and over from the client is, Max, what's going on with the international flights? What happened with the international flights? We have good news in Argentina because the National Civil Aviation Administration, that is the ANAC because the acronym, authorized last week some companies to resume the regular flight as of October the 7th, is the next week. So aviation industry is getting back to the normal with baby steps. Let's go on with some ideas, insights related to Uruguay. The current scenario in Uruguay presents partial opening borders for returning nationals, legal residents, and work and visa travelers. That's a very important difference between Argentina and Chile, as you mentioned. So companies don't need to seek for an exemption nor special procedures because workers sponsored by companies are allowed to apply for visa following the regular procedures, okay? Yeah. It is important to mention that Uruguay is the LATAM country with more flexible borders and better results to flatten the pandemic cliff, right? Yeah. What are they doing to get these satisfactory results? Authorities have implemented a protocol entering into the country with health requirements, including swab test and PCR, both in country of origin and once in Uruguay, a new test after 7 days of mandatory isolation.
Okay, yeah.
What next about Argentina and Chile and Uruguay? Let's start for Uruguay. They are sticking to the plan followed so far, which have been shown excellent results. Nowadays, Uruguay is focused to reach November with borders fully open for visa waivers, okay? This way, travelers will be able to enter to the country for tourism or to switch category to legal residence in country. Just a quick approach in terms of taxation. In Uruguay, this country intended to ease their tax burden for naturals and legal entities to attract even more foreign investors and ventures, discouraged by the high taxes of the surrounding countries in the region, including Argentina and some cases Brazil as well. What we can expect regarding Argentina, in terms of immigration procedures, right? Yeah. We have seen that the immigration directorate have shown like a willingness to address company concerns in terms of immigration, analyzing case by case, company by company. It was mentioned by Irina, right? Yeah. It's the same in Argentina. So we suggest the companies thinking out of the box in terms of government relation. This is very important in Argentina, at least until the end of the year, right? Yeah. As a tool to ensure successful immigration processes. And finally, with respect to Chile, authorities are discussing right now in the parliament to update the old immigration law dated in 1975. So we can expect like a challenging scenario in terms of overlapping immigration laws and delays of visa approval. But again, in order to think positively, it is very important to mention that corporate can resume their global mobility programs and make decisions whenever Chile and also Argentina and Uruguay as well provide alternatives and mechanisms to enter to the country and apply for visas even during the lockdown. That's all that I have to say about Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay.
Max, I want to ask you, would you say, would people, like if a client had somebody who needed to be in the region, would it be better, like at this point, would it be better for them, if they had the option, if they had an entity, would it be better for them to be in Uruguay than in Argentina or Chile, you know? Like, would you?
Yeah, what depends of the, again, case by case and the activity that this assignee is going to perform. Of course, Uruguay, it's more flexible in terms of immigration. So if we speak about business proposals, for example, definitely Uruguay is going to be the best options. Yeah. But however, again, there is a chance to apply for special permits in Argentina and Chile in terms of the kind of activities that this person is going to perform.
Yeah. So yeah. It's so interesting. I wish that we had much longer and that we were all in one place. But Danny, tell us about Brazil. And Brazil is definitely another place, right? So this comment, this kind of recurring theme of talking to the government. And you know what you were saying, Max, about online applications becoming possible. This has happened in so many places as well. You know, Ireland is another example where it used to be all paper-based and now it's gone online. And US, you know, you used to have signatures and all the wet signatures they call. I think that's really interesting. But Danny, tell us about Brazil. What's happening in Brazil?
Okay, thank you, Sophie. So yeah, we have two different situations here in Brazil. If you enter by air, it's permit now. But if you enter by land, sea, or other waterways, so you are not allowed to enter. So there are some restrictions, but there are some exceptions on this situation too. So these restrictions do not apply for Brazilians, for permanent or temporary foreigner that's residents in Brazil and have the registration with the federal police. And also the foreign national spouse, partner, child. So there are some exceptions for this rule. Also, this entry is not prevented the entry by air or waterways for the maritime crew. As everybody knows, we have a big operation for oil and gas in Brazil. So when we saw the restrictions and they were closing everything, the companies and the government was like in panic. So they opened, they did some flexibility for these maritime crews specifically. There are entry restrictions for foreign nationals coming from Venezuela, but I don't think that's the way the COVID situation. It's much more because, you know, the political situation in Venezuela. So I think that they are restricting now, but using more the COVID to use like an excuse, let's close the border for Venezuela for now. A quarantine, it's not required. It's not like mandatory. Let's say there are recommendations from the Ministry of Health that everybody that enters stay for 14 days, but just a recommendation because, you know, I do not like to enter a lot on details of the political situation, but our president disagrees with the health Minister of Health department here. So it's just a recommendation, but it's no penalties or no control. So, but it's important to mention that here in Brazil, we have a public health system. So now they are, as of course, they are super busy, and so it's not able to control the situation now because our numbers keeping going out in some cities. So it's mandatory to enter, it's open, it's mandatory, but to enter, it's mandatory to present a health insurance. And this health insurance, there are a couple of criteria now. You need to show this in Portuguese, in English, or Spanish. And this needs to cover out the entire trip or the entire time that you're gonna be here in Brazil. There are certain amounts, it's 30,000 Brazilian reais. It's not that much, but it's mandatory to present this. The reason is because we have a public health system here, and we do not like the foreigner use this, so they need to cover for the time that they will stay here. We don't have any exit requirements in place. You asked this at the beginning. We don't have this. I think that's very interesting, but now we're not having the control for people that are too much. Imagine people that's leaving, so it's not our reality for now.
That's interesting. The exit requirements is I mean, it's interesting. It's Dubai has them, Australia has them, Saudi. Faisal, I should have got you to come and speak about Saudi, because Saudi is really interesting, because Saudi was stopping Saudi people. You know, it's all about if you're going to let your own residents and nationals come back in, then you might want to stop them going out and picking up the virus everywhere, I guess. You know? But
yeah,
so
but
yeah, no, go on.
No, I think Saudi was the only country in the world that was stopping people, their own residents, to come back to.
That's the only one I know of, you know.
Yeah, that's the only country that was stopping their own residents to return, irrespective of the situation.
Yeah, pretty.
Yeah, so yeah, just to finish here my comments about Brazil, as I explained before, we are like open and people can enter in Brazil. I'm just a little bit afraid because the things here have been changing a lot, one day for the other. And the problem is the communication from the airports and the Brazilian authorities when the foreigners are entering Brazil. So they are not very updated or very well informed. So my tip is like for everybody contact us. I'm not only selling my services here, but contact your contacts in the country, double check one day before, and prepare the employees or the foreigners that are coming to Brazil with a letter, with a copy of the legislation, say, yes, you are allowed to enter, because we haven't seen a lot of confusions when they enter here on the board.
This is the thing, right? I mean, I literally live in fear because it changes so frequently, and it's between the airline, it's between the person at the airport, at the port of entry, you know, there's so many things that can go wrong now, which, you know, like we were saying, is but also just, I mean, it gives me the chills, really, you know.
In fact, one of the milestone cases that we achieved in India during the lockdown, but the application was done almost a year and a half ago, was a PRS, which is the permanent residency status. It's a new visa type granted to investors in India. And the German couple have now moved lock, stock and barrel to India, making India its home for the next 10 years. And despite getting the visa, they refuse to travel to Germany because in the 1 week they have to be in Germany, they have to complete 14 days of quarantine in Germany. Then they come back, another 14 days in quarantine, and it's just not worth it. So They just refused to go. And they're like, and the reason to travel was the 75th wedding anniversary of the parents.
Oh my God.
And despite that, they're missing the travel because it's just not worth the hassle. And you don't know when you go to Germany, and if there's another lockdown, and if something goes wrong, you don't know what happens.
Oh, Sophie, can I use this bubble? If I go to Croatia, can I then?
Absolutely.
It's like, well, yeah, today, but tomorrow maybe.
Today,
not.
exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, Jim, we need to ask you about the US. And Jim, I'm going to mute myself because I feel like it's very important.
Oh, Sophie, I thought you would just ask me questions.
No, I just want to make sure I don't speak over you or interrupt you in this televised broadcast that we're having here, because you know.
And I have to say, I like your earrings very much. They look great.
Yeah. So anyway, so tell us what's happening in the US. Are we allowed in? Are we allowed out? Are we all banned?
Well, we kind of have an identity crisis, you know, right now in the US. Our consulates reopened starting in July 15th, and we are scheduling visa interviews for many clients. It's important to keep in mind, though, that even though our consulates are open, and some people don't even need visas to travel here if you have a valid ESTA, we have travel restrictions, and we have restrictions on certain visa classifications. And whenever I think about this and when I'm explaining it to clients, I kind of think of, and I don't know why, maybe I just equate everything to food, but I think of it as a layer cake, right? And we have multiple layers. So you just can't think about one restriction. You have to think about how all these restrictions fit together. Yeah. And so, you know,
like a lovely cocktail, maybe.
A cocktail too. Yes, multiple ingredients. So with regard to the travel restrictions for certain countries, let's start there. Because those started back in January, and the president continued to issue proclamations, adding more and more countries to the list. And the list right now includes China, Iran, the Schengen region, the UK, Ireland, and Brazil. And so I did that kind of in the order in which they were introduced. And, you know, everyone tends to think that, well, you can't travel from those countries. And that's not true. First of all, if you're a US citizen or you're a permanent resident or you're a close family member, the restrictions don't apply. And there are a number of other individuals where this travel restriction doesn't apply, right? So you may be able to travel to the US even if you're coming from one of those countries directly. If you don't fall within one of those exceptions, then you have a few options. One would be to go to, and this is a new term for me, but I'm excited to learn it, a travel bubble, right? We have had clients go from, say, Italy to Croatia and spend 14 days in Croatia, and then travel not directly from Croatia, because you can't fly directly from Croatia to the US, but they were able to travel from Croatia and not transit back through Schengen or UK or Ireland and get here. So that's one option. But we also have this ability to request a national interest exception. And before the consulates opened, we would go to the Customs and Border Protection Office at the international airport where the individual was flying into. And we would make the case there that this individual should be allowed to board their plane to travel to the US. And we generally advised that the best port of entry was JFK International Airport in New York. There were certain airports that we would completely avoid because when we called them to speak with their leadership, they had no idea that an exception was even available. So we definitely didn't want to go to those airports and ask for an exception because obviously they had no protocol. They didn't know what the standard was. And so we would most of the time, 9 times out of 10, go to JFK. So we'd make sure that our client was traveling to JFK and request the exception. And we had a lot of success. It was first of all, JFK was incredibly efficient, very accommodating. And we were able to bring in a lot of people who needed to be here for a number of reasons. And at times, we are also basically arguing the case that they should be able to come in on the ESTA, that what they were going to be doing was permissible on the visa waiver program, and that they didn't need a visa because in a lot of instances, they didn't have a visa. So there is the travel restriction based upon where you're coming from. We also, as I mentioned, have restrictions on certain visa categories. And this is a newer issue. It first started with I think it was first the Chinese visa restriction for certain J1s. And that was, you know, it came out during the time of COVID, but it was more political. Basically, if you are a J1 researcher and you've received funding from any institution within the Chinese, let me make sure it's the military civil fusion theory, that if you received money from a Chinese entity that was part of this I don't know, apparatus of the Chinese government, then you could not obtain a J1 visa. That really didn't impact too many individuals, but it was introduced during the COVID time. And then we had this more important restriction, which applies to L1s, H1s, and certain other J1s. The J1 visa category is this catch-all visa category. You can bring in au pair into the US on a J1. You can bring in a scientific researcher, a scholar, or interns and trainees. Under this presidential proclamation that was issued on June 22nd, they focused on the J1 interns and trainees. So basically, the instructions were that as of June 24th, if you were applying for an L, an H, or a J1 intern or trainee visa, then the consulate could not issue it if it was your first visa. Now, your first L, H, or J visa. There are certain exceptions. It didn't apply to individuals who were in the United States on June 24th or who already had L visas. In addition, if you had, if you were married to a US citizen, then it didn't apply. And if you were coming to the US for COVID patient care or COVID research, it didn't apply. And so we were able to obtain L's and H visas and J visas for a number of clients whose work involved either COVID patient care or COVID research, or who had a US citizen spouse. And even in those situations, everything was so new and it was a little chaotic that the consulates still, you know, kind of were uncertain as to what to do. We would get an L visa appointment scheduled, and then suddenly they would cancel it, and then we would go back and say, no, don't cancel it. They've got a US citizen. Don't worry about this. And so there still seemed to be a number of additional hoops to jump through. And then once the visa was issued, or if you were getting a travel exception for someone coming in on an ESTA, we still took a lot of time with our clients to make sure that they understood what the next steps were. Because it wasn't just that, you know, okay, JFK granted the exception, great, we're all done, right? No. We had individuals who had traveled, they were coming in on L's, we got the exception from JFK, but then when they showed up at the airport at Charles de Gaulle, the CBP office there knew nothing. And so, you know, luckily we were able to work with the port director or the CBP office there to make sure that they got the information. But, you know, we wanted to prepare our clients for the possibilities that could arise. And then once they arrived in the US, what was going to happen? And this guy goes to your question, is quarantining required? And under US immigration law, it's not required. But we always caution our clients that these exceptions that we're asking for, they're discretionary. These officers do not have to approve it. So if they get the sense that you're cavalier and you don't really understand how significant this pandemic is, and that you're not going to practice social distancing or you're not going to wear a mask, those are all discretionary factors that they could use to determine that you shouldn't receive the exception or the waiver. So we always recommend folks, listen, you probably don't have to quarantine, but one, look at those local rules. Remember, we have 50 states, and each state has a different set of rules. So you want to make sure that you know what the rules are there. And when you're before the consular officer, you want to make it clear that you understand the importance of this, that you're going to take this seriously, that you will follow the local rules, and you won't be irresponsible with your behavior. So no quarantining required per se, but we always want people to act responsibly. There are no exit requirements going from leaving the United States. But I should mention, you know, I've kind of focused on ESTA and the L1 visas, and I haven't talked anything about the borders. And technically, officially, the northern and southern borders have been closed. That said, individuals who are coming in who are deemed to be essential workers have been allowed in. And we have seen the customs agents, they tend to interpret that concept pretty broadly. But it is not, the borders are not open for tourism or general travel, right? So they are still restricted, but we do, when I say border, I really mean the border, the land border, because you can fly in without problems. So that's interesting as well. I lumped in the COVID-related travel exception with the national interest waiver that you have to apply for if you're going to apply for an L, H, or J visa. I mentioned that, you know, certain people, the L, H, and J proclamation doesn't apply to. And then if you're coming in for COVID patient care or COVID research, it doesn't apply to you either. But then there is a national interest exception. And initially the consulates seem to be refusing to schedule L visa interviews for individuals who we thought had great national interest arguments. And their position initially was that this exception or waiver only applied to individuals conducting COVID patient care or COVID research. But the proclamation was clear that this was broader. And suddenly the State Department reversed itself and started allowing individuals to apply for the national interest waiver for when they're applying for an L, H, or J visa. And what we try to do is really understand what our clients are doing and whether this individual will work in an area that is critical to our national infrastructure. And there is, the Department of Homeland Security has this beautiful website that talks about the national infrastructure and what are the key industries. So we go to that and we make our arguments showing that this individual will be engaged in activities that may impact multiple critical areas of our critical infrastructure, and that these individuals play important roles. We've had, you know, knock on wood, we've had a lot of success at lots of different consulates.
People can. So we've literally got like 30 seconds left, and by the way, your head is certainly made of fine stuff. But yeah, so people can come in for work. And are you saying even people may be able to travel in on their ESTAs given very strong justification? I mean, I can't just go and eat layer cake and have cocktails with you, but if I had a very strong reason.
Yeah. Yes,
we
just one example. We had someone who had an ESTA, needed to come to the U.S. to install this piece of art, really, at one of our most renowned galleries in the country. And it was I think it was a $30 million piece of art. And it was in part of the public area of the gallery. And so we made the argument that this individual's work was critical to the safety, because it was right on the street in a major city in the United States. And so if it was improperly installed, it could have harmed pedestrians, which there are many in this city. And so we were able to bring them in on the ESTA because it was actually an after-sales service.
Yeah, I see. So exactly, if the activity you're doing qualifies under that and is, that makes sense. Okay, so we have to finish. We've gone through the entire world in 90 minutes. I can't believe it. And there's so much to talk about and so little time. But basically, I think our message as a group to each other and to all of our attendees is it does seem to be possible, right? It is possible to get into these countries, but there's just this maze. I think it was you, Kasia, said it was a maze of things to kind of navigate through. And I think that's just going to get worse, isn't it? Or better, depending on how you look at it.
There are all sorts of opportunities.
Yeah, exactly. You can see it as an opportunity. I think so. So I don't know what happens. I actually didn't ask you what happens if we've got any questions that we haven't answered, but I think we have answered most of them. And I think you guys are all amazing and I miss you so much and I will see you soon, I hope.
It would be nice.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Lovely seeing you.
Thank you. It was lovely. Thank you, everyone. Good night, good day, good evening.
Bye.
Depending on which part of the world you are in.